Hello, and this is part two of the sectionalist crisis. So, we covered the area of history that is between the 1815 and 1850 prior to this video. So, this video will talk about the 1850s and how this decade really leads to civil war. So, as you're looking at this map and listening to me drink water, one of the things you're going to notice is that I said in the last video that we added more territory during the Mexican-American War than we did the Louisiana Purchase. So all of this land here in blue and purple was added during the 1840s. And what you notice is that the old Compromise of 1820 doesn't really work anymore because you've got all this territory out here that can now be slave states. Plus, you have a lot of territory in the north that is inhabitable or uninhabitable. So no one is rushing to move to Nebraska. No one is rushing to move to Wyoming, South Dakota, Montana. No one's rushing to move to Nevada and Utah at this time. So your big population centers are Texas, California, and Oregon. And there's this real crisis that comes apart of, will California be a slave state? Are we going to break it into two states? How are we going to keep the balance? How are we going to stop these lands? How are we going to stop slavery? Especially when it's very clear that during the Mexican-American War, partly the war is fought to gain territory that is south of this border so we can expand slavery. How are we going to stop this? Part of it is the Compromise of 1850. So again, another compromise. So going back to my map here, you'll notice if you draw a line, the Texas border was at one point this light blue area. Texas gives all of this up, and if you notice, they are conveniently right along the Missouri southern border. So they go right up to that line, and that is Texas, and they are allowed to exist as a slave state. California tries to admit as 5 different states, 2 of them slave, 3 of them free. They initially want that to happen, but then in the end, California is just made entirely a free state against the wishes of the South. So if we go back to the map, you'll notice that California does have territory in that slave area. This is a huge concession by the South because this is the major population area. Los Angeles, San Diego, all of these places would become highly population centers late in the 1800s, and the North has made this entire area free state. Three and four kind of offset each other. So if we go back to the map, any area in green cannot be slave. Any area in blue or yellow is allowed to choose whether they want to be a slave state, and that is a huge victory for the South. And of course, the biggest victory for the South is number 5. So the fugitive slave law allows the southern states to extradite former slaves who have escaped. So southern states can send agents to the north, capture slaves, and bring them back to the South unaccosted. Okay, the North cannot stop this from happening. And of course, many Southerners take full advantage of the fugitive slave law. So you might think that 1 and 2 are big L's for the South. You might see 3 and 4 as kind of a draw, but 5 is a huge W for the South. And we'll see as it goes forward, the fugitive slave law plays a key part in the breaking up of the United States. This is one of my favorite stories. So let's talk about the abolitionist movement for a second. So this actually happens in Alton, Illinois, which is about 10 miles north of where we are in Illinois. You cross the bridge, you're in Illinois. So at one point in time, Alton, Illinois was considered like a twin city to St. Louis. It was growing in population faster than St. Louis, and many people actually thought that Alton was going to take over as the metropolis or metropolitan area because Illinois is a free state, it is industrialized, and Missouri is not as industrialized, and it is a slave state. Elijah Lovejoy actually lived in St. Louis. He ran an abolitionist newspaper, and he had to leave St. Louis because there was a price on his head and people had destroyed his printing press. So he goes to Alton, which is in a free territory, and again starts publishing an abolitionist newspaper. Now, it's kind of interesting. The man lost 3 different printing presses while he was in Alton. They would come, steal his printing press, dump it in the Mississippi River, and like that would teach him. Yet the man always goes and buys a new one. So on one night in 1837, St. Louisans come to Alton, and they first of all burn his printing press, then dump it in the ashes into the river. They burn his printing area, and then they tar and feather Mr. Lovejoy, drag him through the streets of Alton, take him down to the riverbank, and execute him. So not only is this a key story in the St. Louis area because it shows that the Missouri's big role in the history of the slavery, but Elijah Lovejoy is one of the first white people to die because he does not support slavery. And as sad as that is, this is a key turning point in the abolitionist movement because now you have white Northerners who are no longer sitting on the sidelines and watching this happen. They are putting their lives on the line, and it starts to change the feeling in the North and in the South. Now, of course, fun fact, you can visit the Elijah Lovejoy Monument in Alton. You can see it from the bridge. It's in a cemetery right behind Fast Eddie's, the restaurant. And of course, there is a restaurant, Elijah P's in Alton. That is where his printing press was. Some other really interesting abolitionists, of course, William Lloyd Garrison. He is kind of the main person in the North who is on the abolitionist side. He's the founder of the Liberator. He's also, like we said, the founder of the American Colonization Society. He is the big, prominent Northerner with the deep pockets. Of course, Frederick Douglass is the leader on the black side. Frederick Douglass, of course, wrote the narrative about a slave's life, and it was based on his own life before he escaped slavery. And Frederick Douglass was admired because this man would go around and make speeches, and of course, with the fugitive slave law, many Southerners tried to arrest him and take him back. Speaking of the fugitive slave law, another one, Solomon Northup, he was a free musician living in the North who was kidnapped and sold into slavery via the fugitive slave law, and he is the basis of the movie 12 Years a Slave. But probably the biggest abolitionist who made a dent in the feelings of the North was Harriet Beecher Stowe. So Harriet Beecher Stowe visits the South in the 1830s, 1840s, and then writes a fictionalized version of a slave family living in the South. And of course, She makes up many of the details, but a lot of the details that she makes up are based on things that she saw. And many Northerners read this book, and they're, for the first time, Northerners kind of get out of this mentality that slavery is better than living in Africa. You know, many Northerners feel sympathetic to the slaves prior to this book because they feel that the slaves are treated better than the industrialized people of the North, so the immigrants who are coming in. But this book changes their minds. It really opens them to the savagery of slavery. And once this book is written and read, many Northerners decide to become abolitionists. Back to the old debate of free states versus slave states and how can we keep the balance. Kansas and Nebraska are organized into territories and they are allowed to vote over whether they are going to become free or slave states. And this ignites a huge conflict in the United States in both Washington, D.C., and Kansas and Nebraska. Prior to the vote, there's kind of a mini civil war in Kansas between pro-slavery interests from Missouri and anti-slavery interests from the North. So people are moving to Kansas from the North and from the South just so they can vote. I just want you to wrap your brains around that for a second, that people who are living in Wisconsin or Georgia would up and move to the middle of nowhere just so they could vote on whether or not this territory in the middle of nowhere was going to become a slave or free state. And of course, there is a mini civil war that goes on. We'll talk more about those things in a minute. So, Kansas and Missouri really don't like each other, and I apologize for the pro Mizzou Tiger rhetoric on this page, as I am from Mizzou, and that Kansas is neither a proper noun nor a proper place, and you should never capitalize Kansas if you go to Mizzou, but that's neither here nor there, because while the Mizzou-Kansas rivalry is based on a really serious thing that happened in the middle of the 1850s, and that was the burning down of Lawrence, Kansas. So if we go back to the map, Lawrence, Kansas is right here. So you have Topeka, which is the pro-abolitionist, and you have Lecompton, which is pro-slavery, and you have many free state people living along this area just south of Kansas City. And what you see is that people from Missouri come over to Kansas and they assault these people, they kill people, they burn their houses. Basically, hey, go home, we don't want you to vote here. And of course, I love this mural about John Brown. We'll talk more about John Brown in class, but I just like the crazy look on his face. Also, at this time, we go from having one party to two parties to six parties. And I think that is really relevant because you see there's so much conflict building up in the country, and there's a lot of factions growing, and we really just don't know which way we're going to go. So let's try to make sense of this page for a second. So the Jefferson Republicans, who were Andrew Jackson's party, really are still around as what is called the Southern Democrats. So these people are small government, states' rights, pro-slavery. They fraction off, though, and there is a second Democrat party who is still small government, still states' rights, still pro-slavery, but Unlike the Southern Democrats, they're not wanting to leave the country just yet. They're wanting to keep the country together and compromise. So you see the Democratic Party is kind of fracturing in two. And the Whig Party is kind of fracturing in two also, because the Whigs are the holdovers from the Federalists. They're big government, national rights, but they are still pro-slavery. The Republicans form out of the Whig Party, and I know this is really confusing because the Republicans used to be up here and now they're here, but just keep with me when I say the Republicans are kind of like the Federalists 3.0. So the Republicans care about national government, they care about big government, they care about infrastructure, they care about high tariffs, and oh, by the way, they are anti-slavery. And this is the first party that really takes up anti-slavery as a mantle. And of course, you have these two parties, shocker, anti-immigration. The United States really has a problem with immigrants, even though we are a nation of immigrants. And this isn't the first time or the last time that we want to kick all of the immigrants out. Big reason that we want to kick the immigrants out is because the immigrants are coming over and are inserting themselves on the Republican side of the debate. So if you are a Southerner, you want to get rid of immigrants because the immigrants are coming over and supporting the Republican Party in droves. And of course, the Free Soil Party is basically exists only to keep slavery out of Kansas and Nebraska. So really complicated. You're starting to see a lot of factions growing out, and you're starting to see why there is conflict brewing, because you have 6 major political parties in a system that's really only designed to handle 2. And the election of 1856 really starts to show that fracturing again. So you'll notice on the surface that it doesn't look very close on the map, but you'll notice that Millard Fillmore really takes votes from John C. Fremont. So you're noticing already that more people support anti-slavery than support slavery. So this is the first time you've seen that more people are voting against slavery than they are voting to support the slavery. So even though the North only wins 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 states, you're starting to see that more people are living in the North and more people are supporting anti-slavery. And that is huge because this is a turning point, and this is going to cause the South to realize the battle is lost. Their only hope is to leave the country and start their own government. I like this picture because Charles Sumner and Preston Brooks. Charles Sumner is an abolitionist. He gives a speech on the Senate floor condemning slavery, and of course, Preston Brooks, who is from South Carolina, gets up and beats him with his cane. So you think about senators today, throwing shade at each other on Twitter and in the media, but this guy literally took his cane and beat up another senator on the Senate floor, and people stood there and watched, kind of U-City style, and didn't intervene. So I think that's really interesting. Another St. Louis connection, the Scott versus Sanford trial of 1857. So you've probably heard of Dred Scott. And Dred Scott, of course, is a slave who moves from Missouri, which is a slave state, to a free state in Wisconsin and later Illinois. He says that based on the Compromise of 1850, he should be allowed to be free. He is no longer living in a slave state. He is allowed to be free. The Supreme Court takes up this case and says that via the fugitive slave law, Dred Scott has no case. So yes, he is residing in a free territory, but his master, via the fugitive slave law, has the right to keep him in slavery even though he is in a northern territory. Furthermore, I like this part because it's just so bigoted. And Roger Taney says that slaves do not have rights under the Constitution. So basically, property cannot sue the owner. So, if you just think about your iPod cannot sue you, and that's basically the same sentiment here. And he also rules that the Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850 were unconstitutional. So the only thing that really matters here is the fugitive slave law, and the fugitive slave law keeps Dred Scott a slave even though he is not living in a free territory or in a slave territory anymore. Kind of a sad story about Dred Scott. He does eventually get his freedom. He is purchased by a northerner, but once he gets his freedom, he dies within 2 years. So he doesn't really get to enjoy it that much. And of course, 1858, the emergence of this man, Abraham Lincoln, who was a failed congressman and a lawyer from Illinois, who takes on Stephen Douglas, who is seen as an intellectual, rich elitist, and he is a pro-Southerner. Lincoln is anti-Southerner, and these two have a bitter Senate debate and a bitter Senate race, and Stephen Douglas gets money from all across the South and support from all across the South, and Lincoln gets support and money from all across the North. And again, here is another example of Northern money and Northern populations moving to Illinois, Southern populations moving to Illinois just for one Senate race, because one senator can tip the balance either way. Abraham Lincoln does not win the election. Douglas beats him, but we will see that these two are going to run against each other again. In 1859, John Brown, of course, like we said, was part of Kansas. He goes to Kansas as part of a northern contingent to fight the pro-Southerners, and it is in Kansas that he decides that slavery is immoral, the South is immoral, and they have to be judged. So at this time, there are two federal arsenals. A federal arsenal is where there are guns being stored by the U.S. military. One is in St. Louis, Jefferson Barracks. The other is in Virginia. So John Brown's big plan was he was going to go to the federal arsenal, take a bunch of Winchester repeating rifles, steal them, and hand them out to slaves who lived in Virginia, and he was going to kind of create his own slave army. And John Brown doesn't really succeed in anything at Harper's Ferry. Of course, the first person that he does kill in Harper's Ferry is actually a free black man who is the porter of a train depot. So the porter notices him and his men coming in off the train tracks. He runs to alert the citizens, and they shoot him. And of course, really quickly, the citizens of Harper's Ferry come and they pin John Brown up in an ammunition storehouse. There's a fire. He's basically burned out, and he surrenders. So Harper's Ferry, not very successful. But here again, you have a white man who is wanting to take guns and arm slaves. And this does not sit very well for the South. In fact, Virginia is allowed to try John Brown because the president, James Buchanan, does not want to be seen as someone who is anti-abolitionist. So Virginia is allowed to arrest John Brown, Virginia is allowed to try him. And shocker, it takes him about 3 days to find him guilty of treason. But take a minute and read this quote. So this is a quote that John Brown slips to his jailer on the way to being executed. And many people take this quote and they see John Brown as the person who brought upon the Civil War. And of course, John Brown is thought to have been funded by the Secret Six, which were wealthy Northerners, and he was kind of seen as a scapegoat or a patsy. So they paid money for him to start this rebellion, knowing that it wouldn't succeed, but it would just enrage the South and rally the North to fighting slavery instead of just talking about slavery being bad. And we noticed that we told you that the political landscape of the United States is very fractured. Again, there's essentially 3 states' rights people running against one national rights person, Abraham Lincoln. Stephen Douglas, Breckinridge, John Bell. Breckinridge is pro-slavery. Bell is pro-slavery. Douglas is kind of in the middle. He's wanting to contain slavery. And actually, Abraham Lincoln is not openly anti-slavery in 1860. He runs on this platform of we are just going to contain slavery in the South. In fact, many Northerners don't like Abraham Lincoln because they think he doesn't go far enough. He's too moderate. But as we'll see, this is the brilliancy of Abraham Lincoln's plan. And of course, this is where I kind of show my bias because I am a big Lincoln supporter here, and I just want to show you his campaign platform. And look how it is put together. This was meticulously put together as a politician. He has a little bit of something for everyone here. And if you've ever read Team of Rivals, you'll know that Abraham Lincoln was given the Republican nomination simply because he was seen as the most moderate and the most reaching of any of the candidates. Everyone thought in 1860 William Seward was going to be the nominee. William Seward is a senator. He gets up on the Senate floor about a year before the presidential campaign starts, and he gives this fiery anti-slavery speech on the floor of the Senate. And many people say, you can't get that man elected because he's on the record as being anti-slavery, but Lincoln is only on the record as saying he wants to control slavery. He doesn't want to get rid of it. And of course, we'll never know Lincoln's main thoughts here. Many people assert that Lincoln was anti-slavery. He just couldn't say it because he was campaigning. Other people say that Lincoln is a hypocrite and he has all this anti-slavery rhetoric as a president when it's popular to have the anti-slavery rhetoric, but as he's campaigning, he doesn't really support it. And then there's some people that say, hey, Lincoln's a white guy. He couldn't not like slavery. But I like this slide because it really shows Lincoln as the master politician, and it really shows how Lincoln is set to win the election. The 1860 election is probably the most contentious of any presidential election other than the election of 1800. And you'll see just based on this map where the divide is. So you'll notice the purple states are all Lincoln states. It is a very clear geographical place where Lincoln is voted for. And the South really turns its back on Stephen Douglas. So you'll notice the South almost all votes for either John Bell or John Breckinridge, and those are the two candidates that are pro-slavery. Again, Stephen Douglas wants to find a compromise, and you can see in 1860, America was not really ready to compromise. So despite what Donald Trump says, I don't think at this point in time, compromise would have solved anything. We were past that point, as you see by this chart, because you'll notice Stephen Douglas does get almost 30% of the vote, but you can clearly see that there is a divide. Something that I really want to point out to you is look at this percentage of votes. That is the lowest percentage of votes for any winning president ever. So 60% of Americans voted against Abraham Lincoln, yet he won the election. And that kind of tells you why the Civil War happens at this point in time, because the majority of Americans did not want Abraham Lincoln as their president. And once he is elected president, they decide it's time to leave the country. And there goes South Carolina again. A mere month after Lincoln is nominated or is elected, the Electoral College gets together December 9th or 19th and votes him in. The next day, South Carolina secedes. And of course, we're not shocked that South Carolina is the first state to secede, because if you'll remember from the last video, South Carolina has already tried to secede in 1837. As a last-ditch effort to keep the South, Lincoln, through a man named John Crittenden, issues the Crittenden Compromise. And again, these are concessions given to the South. And look at all of these things that the North is willing to give the South if the South stays in the Union. Again, we're getting rid of the 3630 parallel. We're going to put it in a constitutional amendment that Congress cannot get rid of slavery. We're going to not only enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, but we're going to compensate owners who lose slaves. Okay? I'm not sure if Donald Trump has read his history, because if compromise could have saved the Civil War, I don't know what else you could have given the South. It was pretty clear as we go back to the map here. There is a clear divide. It has been brewing, and finally, we are going to decide once and for all whether slavery is allowed to exist or slavery is abolished. And again, in December, we will talk about the Civil War, but this is how we got from War of 1812 to Civil War. Thank you for listening.